Knowing where, when, or even how to add texture to your ink drawings can be rather daunting. So in this video, I'm going to take a look at some of the more basic ways that you could add surface texture to your pieces. I'm going to start off by just giving myself a couple pretty simple shapes, things that I can work within, and because they're all similar to one another, we'll have the ability to see how this texture looks on several different surfaces. I'm going to start this first one simply by going around the outline that I've laid down. I think it's important to have a sketch underneath your ink drawing most of the time, though perhaps not all the time. It can be fun to just start working and see what happens. But especially if you're getting into it for the first time, start simple. Start with an outline. In fact, on this one, I'm not going to be adding any texture. I'm going to allow the object just to be what it is. So it's this slightly awkward egg shape that is casting a shadow underneath itself. And this is how a lot of ink drawing can actually be done. You don't need to add any texture to a surface. And even if you add texture to a lot of your surfaces, you can often add a level of contrast and therefore intrigue and mystery when you leave some surfaces blank. You can see right off the bat though, the second the cast shadow is finished, it looks as if the object is three-dimensional. This happens because our brain and our eyes tell us that it must have some form. It's casting a shadow underneath itself. That is the most simple way that you can go about working with texture in an ink drawing. Simply use your shadows and don't apply texture individually. On this next one, I'm going to work with some really rudimentary hatching. This can be a little bit more difficult because you have to think about the surface of the object, which way it's moving, how it's functioning, and if we get into a little bit more advanced techniques, you're going to be thinking about where light is coming from. In this drawing, the light source really is directly above, and we can tell this really easily because the cast shadow is directly underneath our objects. Now, on the first object, the idea is that the texture is totally smooth. This is of course implied by the fact that there are no marks on it. On this second one, we have the implication that there might be some surface texture. If these hatching lines were very fine and consistent, it would imply that that's just being used to show shading. However, the way this is working implies that as the light is hitting the lower sides of this object, we are getting some interesting interactions. For the cast shadow here, I'm simply going to make a whole bunch of parallel lines. This is really good practice, not something that comes naturally to everyone, and certainly didn't come naturally to me. It's something I've just practiced on a lot. I find that these diagonal lines are far easier for me to draw consistently than horizontal or vertical. They really just go with the natural angle that my wrist wants to move at. So this object could be done. I'm not particularly happy with it, so I'm going back and kind of increasing the texture, adding some more notches and marks. This one can be a little bit more difficult, but it's going to afford a little bit more intrigue. You can make it more interesting by varying how you're doing things. On this third object, I'm going to start varying some additional things. Playing with surface texture is basically something we could do till kingdom come. There is no end to how much we can play with it. And so in this video, I'm only going to cover just a couple basic ideas, and I'll start playing with far more complex ones in the future. In fact, if there's anything specifically that you'd like me to touch on in some of the next and upcoming videos concerning ink and ink techniques, please let me know in the comments down below. On this one, I've created a little notch on the left side, and I'm intending that notch to be a chunk of the shell or the stone surface that is overlapping that which comes beneath it. So I have just created the notch on the outline, and then a series of hatch marks to imply that it's casting a small shadow. The fact that the notches disappear about halfway across that main surface tells us that it's actually recombining with the rest of the texture. It's like a piece of paper or a ceiling tile that's been pulled up. It is actually a homogeneous surface at one point, but right where those notches end, it's kind of peeling apart. This is just an interesting way to play with things. And again, these additional notches are giving the idea that maybe those are where other tears could take place. This is just a way to increase the differences across the surface of this object. In my mind, they're starting to feel like dragon eggs. And that's probably just because storytelling is a really fundamental part of drawing. And I think even for little practice objects like this, you're going to make them more enjoyable for yourself if you have a story behind them. So even if you're practicing on cylinders, spheres, elliptical objects like these, I would encourage you to try to implement some concept of storytelling. It's just going to make the whole thing a little bit more interesting. And the more you can do that, the more fun your drawings will be. And that allows you to stick to the drawings for longer, which is a key aspect if you want to continue growing and improving. In this fourth drawing, I'm going to do kind of the same thing I did with that notch on the side, but I'm going to continue exaggerating it. In this one, I am going to continue just to use hatching. I'm not using cross-hatching or anything more complicated. I'm continuing to use lines that are basically just cross-contour. They are moving along the surface of the object. This one is a little bit more pine-coney, and I'm going to come in on the edges after I kind of clarify some of the edge detail, and I'm going to start working my shading in. The hatching in this one is being used, as it has been on the other objects, to show where shadows are on the object. Even on the second one that I drew, where these just strange little pieces of texture are occurring on the bottom, the implication is that something on that surface is bumpy. It's casting these tiny shadows. That long mark might be a crack, but on this one, each of these overlapping layers are casting shadows down on the material below. And this is how our world works. Most of the dark things that we see are not actually the intrinsic color of whatever it is we're looking at, but they're actually the shadows cast by other objects. This is one of the key aspects of drawing with something like hatching, is you have to train your brain to be constantly aware of which direction you're making the marks and for what purpose. For example, as I make these particular hatch marks, you'll notice they're much smaller than the ones that were on the earlier part of that side. That's because that particular chunk of overlap is closer to the surface below it, and therefore it's casting a smaller shadow. Each of the marks that I make when I'm doing this correctly and I'm firing on all cylinders, I'm thinking about how I'm making it. This does mean that this kind of drawing, when you first get into it, can be kind of mentally exhausting, but you will train your mind to keep up with you. And eventually, most of these skills and techniques will be second nature, and you can concentrate on more complicated things. You've probably noticed this in your artistic pursuits in other ways, though. Everything you do when you're learning a new skill requires concentration, requires not just your intuition, but you have to pay attention and think about the marks that you're making. This is, of course, the case here, but it will get easier over time. I don't think about every single mark I'm making every single time I make one right now. A lot of this is just autopilot for me, but it wasn't when I first started drawing this way. As I'm moving to the lowest surface on this object, I'm conscious of the fact that this whole chunk might be shaded in. I'm not 100% sure in my mind how to accomplish that in a way that looks convincing, and that's why I'm moving in slowly from the sides. I'm making my hatch marks and coming in slowly so that I can continue to evaluate when I've reached whatever level I want to reach of shade. And this is a good technique as well. If you are not exactly sure how dark something needs to be, then do not immediately darken it all the way. Darken it slightly. Take a step back. Take a look at it. Is it doing what you want it to? It's easy to make something darker when it comes to ink. It's harder to make something lighter. You have to employ an outside technique in order to lighten something, because it's really just not how the medium works. Now, we're going to move on to a fifth drawing here. This one is going to be employing all of the techniques we've been working on, and actually a couple more. It's going to be starting to incorporate a little bit of cross-hatching, which just means that you're going to have lines that are going to overlap each other, usually in perpendicular fashion, but not always. I'm also going to vary the texture by including some bumps on the side, which are going to require a different manner of textural hatching. I'm using my initial sketch here to work out how I want this thing to function. And I ended up putting 2 of the bumps on the top right because I wasn't thinking about it as I was moving across from the left to the right, so then I included one on the 3rd tier down. Not a big deal, but something that could be solved with a little bit more efficient sketching. As I start to work on the bump here, I'm having my hatch marks wrap around that surface, and they're decreasing in length and size and intensity as they move towards the upper part of the object because that's where light is striking. Again, the implication with pretty much all of these marks is that they are indicating shadow. Shadow is created because something is blocking the light source from hitting that particular chunk of the object. This is pretty much always what's happening when shadows are occurring, though your light sources can vary. And that's really what we're concerning ourselves with as we're working on texture. We're thinking about how light is interacting with this surface. In almost all textural cases, what's happening is that surface texture is casting tiny little shadows in intricate and interesting patterns. And that's what we're working with. That's what we're trying to replicate. Because we're not actually creating texture. We are creating faux texture, the illusion of texture. All drawing is just an illusion. It's an elaborate hoax. We are trying to indicate complicated three-dimensional things on a two-dimensional surface, and we're trying to fool whoever's looking at it into thinking that what we're making is actually three-dimensional. These marks are longer because that chunk of the surface is actually creating a bigger overlap, and so it's creating a longer shadow. And I mentioned that before on one of the prior pieces. It's not something that you need to be totally aware of when you make the sketch. As you're adding the shading and the hatching in this case, you can think about those things and consider them. I didn't have this object in my mind when I started. I've just kind of been manipulating things. You'll also notice that I have hatch marks coming in on the horizontal surfaces to wrap around the object, and then I have vertical hatching moving down the object. I don't have a lot of cross hatching yet, but I will include a little bit of that as I get further on. And again, this is just a more complicated version of cross contour hatching. The marks that I'm making are moving around the object in the same way that you or I would move around the object if we were to shrink ourselves and drive a little Matchbox car around it. Not sure why that's what came to mind, but I think it makes some sense. So as I'm finishing off the final stages of this piece, I'm thinking about how to increase the shadow, because things aren't quite dark enough. I've got these large planes that are just white, and that's not going to be satisfactory for the final piece here. Constantly evaluating, taking a moment, stepping back and looking at your drawing is super important, especially for ink, where patching things up and fixing things is very difficult. It's important to take a break every couple minutes and look at what you've made. Make sure that it is accomplishing what you want it to. It's easy to stop moving in a direction when it comes to ink, but it's incredibly difficult to fix something. Now, in a future video, I probably will go over some techniques for how you can fix if you make a mark in a wrong spot, if you smudge something. There are several techniques, and I'd be happy to go over those. Well, I hope this video was beneficial for you, and I hope you've gotten something out of it and you drew along with me. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.